Oh, this is a bit too close, isn't it? Shall we go for a wider angle? Ah, that's better. This is my favourite macro photograph that I've ever taken. And in this video, I want to share with you a step-by-step guide of how I achieved it to help you to master your macro photography skills. And make sure you stick around to the end because I've got a bonus tip that will give your pictures an extra little boost. Before we delve deeper, I think it's important to go back to basics and understand the difference between macro and close-up photography. A macro photograph is basically where you photograph your subject at 1:1 size or larger. If you're taking a close-up, then you're just getting closer to your subject. A good example would be that we can take a close-up of somebody's head and shoulders and a macro photograph of their eye. In order to achieve a true macro photograph, you're going to need one of these, which is a macro lens. Basically, these help you to focus closer to your subject so it fills the frame. You can achieve a macro style photograph with a standard lens by cropping into your subject afterwards, but obviously these hold a lot more technical quality. They really are the cat's whiskers. Ooh, cat's whiskers, another idea for a macro photo. So now we've got the fundamentals sorted, let's launch into this 5-step guide on how you can master your macro photography. Don't worry, I haven't lost anything, apart from potentially my marbles. I'm carrying out step number 1, which is to have a good look around. One of the traps that a lot of photographers fall into is that they'll gravitate to the first subject that they find. And this can be detrimental, especially if there's a more impactful subject a little bit further down the path. One task that I like to do is to explore a location before I get my camera out. Therefore, I know where the subjects I want to photograph are, and I can spend more time and attention on them than wasting it on the first thing that I find. Oh, I see. You're going to test my knees again, aren't you? Give me a second. Oof, there we go. Step number 2 is to get down low and photograph your subject on its level. I know I've said this in previous videos, but I think it's really important to stress. Imagine your subject has eyes. I suppose if you're photographing an insect, then you don't have to imagine that because it already does have eyes. But even if you're photographing a mushroom or a leaf or a conker or whatever it might be, then get down to your subject's level and photograph from there, because it'll invite you into that macro subject's world and provide an alternative perspective, giving your photographs a lot more impact. I've got to get up now, haven't I? This isn't going to be easy. So, we've found a really interesting subject and we've got down on its eye level to take our photograph. But the next thing that we need to consider is its background. All it takes is one slightly distracting element in the background of your photograph and it will completely take the emphasis away from the subject that you've spent all of that time trying to find. It's almost like looking at one of those photographs where it looks like somebody's got a tree growing out of their head. Oh, am I safe now? Ah, yeah, I think that's better. So any type of contrast in the background of your photograph, whether it's tonal contrast, that difference between light and shade, or colour contrast, that you might have a bright red blob in an otherwise green scene, is going to really distract from your subject. So make sure that you're photographing your subject in front of the most plain background that you can possibly find. It's also a good idea as well to have your subject lighter than its background, because then it will stand out a lot more and create a lot more impact from your shot. One of the most difficult things that you'll ever do as a photographer, other than try and walk past a tree, is to focus a macro photograph, which is why I'm dedicating steps 4 and 5 to this element of the process. It's going to get technical, but I'll explain it in the simplest way I possibly can. The first thing that we need to look into is depth of field. I must admit I'm a bit nervous about walking through these trees now. Depth of field is basically how much of your photograph is in focus, what is known as a focal plane. and it's determined by 4 different elements. Firstly, the focal length of your lens. Secondly, your aperture setting. Thirdly, the distance between your camera and your subject. And finally, the distance between your subject and its background. We'll park focal length for the time being because I think aperture and distance are much more useful things to talk about, especially if we've already got our macro lens set at a set focal length. When it comes to aperture, the wider your aperture, the shallower your depth of field will appear, i.e. there'll be less in focus, your focal plane will be smaller. If you set your aperture narrower, then you'll have more in focus. Your focal plane will be greater. To get that nice simple background that we were talking about in step number 3, you'd think that you would open your macro lens's aperture as wide as it will go to get that really nice shallow depth of field, where our foreground and background are out of focus and our attention is well and truly on our subject, which is perfectly sharp and in focus. But that's not necessarily the case, because this is where distance comes in. The closer you get to your subject with your camera, the shallower your depth of field will become. And remember, with our macro lens, it's allowing us to focus closer on our subject. So therefore, our subject is going to have a very, very, very shallow depth of field. In fact, all of it probably won't be in focus, just a very small slither. So when it comes to getting all of our subject in focus in a macro shot, then we're probably going to have to use a much narrower aperture than we might realise. In fact, this photograph that I shared with you right at the very beginning of the video was actually taken using f8, which we'd usually associate with quite deep depths of field in landscape photography, for example. There are 2 issues that using that narrower aperture in our macro photographs introduces. The first is that nice shallow depth of field that's softening our background might not be softening as much as we might like it to. Therefore, we need to think about that 4th element that affects our depth of field, the distance between our subject and its background. The more distance you place between your subject and its background, the shallower your depth of field will appear. So that's something else to look out for. The second thing is all about light, but I'm going to save that for my bonus tip at the end. So at this point, we've chosen this amazing subject. We've got down to its eye level so we can enter into its world. We've selected a really simple background, and we're going to utilise a reasonably shallow depth of field to achieve the best macro photograph that we possibly can do. But wait a minute, where do we actually focus? Because we're focusing on such a fine detail, autofocus often is a bit clunky when it comes to focusing macro photographs. My best advice is set your camera to manually focus and open up in your camera's menu something called focus peaking. This will make anything that's in your photograph glow a certain colour. Therefore, it's very visual on the screen at the back of your camera or through the viewfinder if you're using a mirrorless camera, what you've got in focus and what you haven't. As I've already said, focusing a macro photograph is one of the most difficult things to do in photography. So practice makes perfect. Don't get frustrated if you don't get it right first time, because I guarantee you won't. Just keep plugging away and keep practicing, and eventually it'll come. So, for that bonus tip that you've all been eagerly waiting for, it's all about balancing light and focus in your macro shots. Like I said earlier, using a narrower aperture can create problems when it comes to lighting your subject, especially if it's a breezy day and your subject's moving around. We have to compromise by using a slower shutter speed or a higher ISO that's going to create noise and degrade the technical quality of our picture. There are 2 ways you can fix this. The first is by utilising something known as focus stacking. This is where you relate back to that wider aperture and take a series of photographs focusing on different parts of your subject. When you merge these pictures together in post-production afterwards, it creates the effect of your subject being fully in focus. But I realise that that's maybe a little bit technical and quite time-consuming as well. So the second way of doing it is carrying a torch around with you. When I take my macro and close-up photographs, I've always got one of these in my camera bag or my pocket, because I can just inject a little bit more light into my photograph by shining it on my subject. It's a little less harsh than flash and gives the effect of a little bit of sunlight coming through and hitting my subject. By warming the photograph down in post-production afterwards, it can actually look like the sun's out, which creates a really nice effect. So now it's your turn to head out with the camera and put these 5 steps into practice, and I guarantee you'll discover the magical world of macro photography. But before you do, please make sure that you've liked the video, subscribed to the Yorkshire Photo Walks YouTube channel, and watched this video next for more advice on composition. And remember, watch your step. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.